Okay, so we're going to start off with the fireside chat portion of today. I just want to also give another big thank you and shout out to Donna, Danielle, and Dan for being here with us today. Let's give them one round of applause and get them to come back on stage. So we've got some really interesting questions. Okay, I'll sit here. We've got some really great questions on Slido right now, and I wanted to take some time to just summarize what we learned today. Dana and Danielle, looking at your raw footage of the research studies, the field studies that you all did, it was so insightful, so compelling, and seeing you use tools like GoPros and just like sketching and just following people around, basically, right? That's what it is. At the airport and to their cars. That was super, super engaging. So I just wanted to say thank you for sharing those videos. That was very compelling. And then Dan, that was a very comprehensive guide to embedding UX as a foundational strategy. I really resonated with that because it's something that I've been trying to do with some of the clients that we work with, and it definitely has its challenges. And it's so nice seeing them being validated that, you know, we're on the right path and that it's supposed to be a marathon and not a sprint. So those were the biggest takeaways I had from those engagements. Okay, so we're gonna start off with some of the questions that have been trickling in. And the first one, I'm gonna open up to any of you. What activities do you find the most successful in fostering more cross-collaboration with non-product teams when exploring solutions? So we talked about working with like engineers and product people, but what are some strategies for people who don't have experiences with that?
So I think, you know, for our team and my teams in the past at Google, what really worked the best is really invite your partners to brainstorm sessions and really be the facilitator, as Dan mentioned. Try to be the expert facilitator. I really recommend a book by Jake Knapp, The Design Sprint. It doesn't have to be, again, a full 5-day sprint, although Jake will help me right now. It really is about understanding what is the challenge you're solving for. Are you working on a new feature, or is it aligning on the roadmap, or is it a kickoff? And based on that, carving the time and really make sure you are facilitating that conversation with your partners.
Yeah, it's honestly like I've had like similar experiences there. A lot of the best collaboration I've had with our partners has been in kind of set, you know, bring everyone in, let's do a design sprint or let's do a workshop together. The other thing that we've had some success with, this doesn't work for every team, but really getting on the same cadence as folks, especially on the engineering side, like respect that they, you know, have stand-ups every day. You should be participating in those. You know, get involved in the things that are important to them, and that also allows you to kind of tap their knowledge, because great ideas are not always going to come from the design team, and I think that, you know, Dana, that's one of the things that you know, bringing them into those workshops provides a space for them to, you know, be creative and bring those ideas forward.
And also, I should add, building on what Dan said, is bug bashes are really big. So making sure you have a big bug bash with your engineering team and everyone test the product together and file bugs together. It really needs to feel like one team. It's not the engineers are here and you're here. It's everyone's working together to build the best product, the best experience.
Yeah, I think, Dan, you mentioned that having that trust across different departments and teams is crucial in terms of getting buy-in and getting people to contribute and to share. This question is for you, Dan, along the same lines as communication and collaboration. During vision planning and facilitation, have you noticed executives having trouble differentiating between the business vision and the product experience vision?
The business vision and the product experience vision. Yeah, I mean, this is like a classic answer. It totally depends. There's certainly been situations where, yeah, they already have an experience in their mind based on kind of the assumptions that they're making on the business side. So yeah, sometimes you have to tease that out. You know, when we're doing those types of sessions, you know, we'll make sure that we either do one of two things. One, we either make sure that we're designing activities that will kind of tease that apart, or, you know, sometimes it's just like, you know, you get to a lunch break and you can kind of take somebody aside, and if you've built up that relationship with that person, you can have an honest conversation about them of like, hey, I think you're seeing some distinctions in places where the rest of the team isn't. Can we like work through that? So yeah, I mean, we've definitely run into those kind of situations. Like, it's definitely not, you know, even at Salesforce, it's not perfect. We're still working through a lot of that with some of the teams that I work with.
I don't know if the Uber team has anything to add or comment on that note. No? That's totally fine.
I'll just say that, again, to me, it's really, like Dan said, it's about building relationships and about really aligning on the problem we're solving for. I really like this quote, actually, for, you know, previously in Google Maps that I work with on falling in love with the problem. So I think if you can get your team to really fall in love with the problem you're solving for, then it's really not about a specific solution in mind. It's really we're all just working towards solving for that.
I think that's super crucial when it comes to understanding what methods and tools to use. It doesn't really matter until you define the problem. I almost said solution. Just define the problem and make sure that everyone's on the same page with that. I have a question for Donna and Danielle. How do you prioritize, sorry, I just lost it. With physical experiences becoming integral to the Uber customer experience, what are a few design principles you might need to consider?
Yeah, I mean, you know, Uber is only starting to be, you know, we're just beginning to realize sort of the potential for these physical spaces to, you know, impact, you know, our brand perception and everything. So some of the principles for, you know, designing these spaces, you know, and all these really comes down to, you know, accessibility. You know, the ADA is a major form factor for us. So, you know, that's really a key driver to a lot of the things that we do, whether it's a built, you know, environment or, you know, it's just, you know, small, you know, interventions like signage or kiosks. That's probably the biggest design principle that we have. You know, our brand director is always asking us, who are you excluding through your design? And we consistently bring that up in our design critiques to make sure that we're being inclusive and, you know, considering all perspectives.
Yeah, because when we think about wayfinding, it's so different than working on like a flat digital landscape. How many of you in the room have worked with physical environments for their design solutions? Oh, that's great, actually. Danielle, just to follow up with that, you mentioned you had some experience with physical spaces before. Can you maybe chat about how you got there?
Before?
Yeah, before. How did you manage to use those skills and transfer them over into your current work?
Yeah, I mean, oddly enough, you know, I started out being a web designer back in the day. But then, you know, an opportunity came up where I was given a chance to work in an architecture, and I decided to pursue it because I'd actually always wanted to be an architect, but the education process was way too long. But, you know, I think the same principles applied. You know, you're essentially building a navigation system, whether it's, you know, on screen or in the physical world. It's the same principles. So, yeah, it was an easy transition, actually.
Great, thank you. And we talked a little bit about accessibility. So understanding that people, you know, have different needs, cognitive, physical, whatever that might be. This actually segues into a question from the audience for Dan and Salesforce. How do you allow your customers to come to you for feedback and capture that kind of data within the accessibility lens?
That's a great question. So we have a couple ways to get at that. We are definitely reaching out to folks who you know, have accessibility needs on a pretty regular basis. So we're actively reaching out to them. The thing that we found that's been most helpful is we have an accessibility designer who's embedded in each of the teams that I manage, and they are as integral a part of that team as any other designer who's on the team. They come to crits. They are involved in literally everything we do, and so that accessibility design and making sure that we're not excluding anyone is always at the forefront of our minds. Just because that person, yeah, it's their responsibility, but their role on the team is to make sure that everybody on the team is aware that they need to be thinking about that constantly, because it's so important for us. It's like one of our company values is inclusivity, and we really want to make sure that we're providing the best experience we can for everybody. I think the example you gave really resonated with me. I think that's a fantastic way to go about it too.
Awesome, thank you so much for sharing. I wanted to also circle back to defining the problem, because I think that's crucial with any kind of business problem, design problem. I have a question from someone that asks, how do you prioritize what problem you want to solve to help your users? And how do you decide when you work with different departments?
So this is a great question. As we mentioned in our process, we really had the research synthesis done together with our partners, with our product leadership, with our engineering leadership, and of course with our operations. So as we were looking at the user problems that we generated, we made sure they are really taking all the themes. So we had like 600 insights from those research trips, including from older decks, and synthesizing them was really about making sure we cover something that, as we said, is general enough and timeless enough that it kind of encompasses everything we're seeing in the field. And then when we wanted to actually go from the why to the what and look at the project, this was really done with a lens of impact versus effort. So how long would it take us to build these things? How many engineering weeks? What's the additional trips or impact we could make? Working with our data science team as well on that.
Yeah, because we all know that synthesizing research takes, I think triple, if not quadruple, the amount of time that you actually intended on doing the actual research studies. That's super interesting to note that you take impact over effort. Dan, I don't know if that's anything you resonate with.
Yeah, no, it's very similar to the way that I've operated before. We oftentimes will draw the quadrant of impact and effort, and you'd really try and knock off the things that are high impact, low effort first, and then from there trying and work your way down the list. But yeah, I mean, at some point there's going to be some hard decisions to make, and on the more tactical stuff, and then making sure that you carve off enough time for the team to really think more strategically and do those exploratory research projects where the team can kind of go deep. Winds up being super important, and you have to fit that in with kind of the day-to-day work. And so as a leader, you do have to make sure that you're making space for that, for your team to make space for that, and really that allowing your team to advocate for that is a huge part of what we do.
Speaking on advocacy, in your presentation you did talk about leading a design team without asking for permissions, with kind of doing first and then asking for forgiveness, perhaps. I have an anonymous question, and it's, when has not asking for permission become a liability? And what should one be cautious of?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think I'm reflecting on the teams that I work with right now, and a lot of the times the penalty for being hesitant to ask for I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this. The penalty for hesitancy is that things just go unaddressed, and that stuff starts to build up over time, and it ultimately adds up to a really poor user experience, and it's death by 1,000 paper cuts. So if the team's not speaking up about some of that stuff, it winds up having a huge impact over time on the product, and on our users, and that's what we all care about so much. What was the second half of the question? I kind of lost track there.
What should one be cautious of when not asking for permission?
Yeah, I guess I'll answer the question I want to answer, I suppose. But I think one of the things to be cautious about when you're not asking for permission is you don't want to be a jerk doing it, because it can easily be a situation where you kind of go in and you say this is how it's going to be, and make a big stink about it if you don't get your way, and that ultimately, like, I keep coming back to relationships. Like, if you are going to do that, you're going to destroy the relationship. People are not going to want to work with you or your team, and you're going to get to a place where you're just going to accomplish way, way less. So you have to find a way to do it that is respectful to the team, is based oftentimes in logic, but we heard this morning about storytelling and like really bringing the user's voice to it. So a lot of those tools are helpful, but you'd want to do it in a way that is not stomping your feet and throwing a tantrum, because that just doesn't. I've never found that that's effective.
I think that's really true, actually. I'm also trying to resonate and find relatable experiences to tie everything in. But I lost my train of thought. So I'm going to open up for all of you another question. How do you position design thinking in your organization without it sounding like a buzzword? Because a lot of the companies that exist don't necessarily always have the fortune of having a high level of UX maturity in their organizations, especially with enterprise or large scale companies. How can we position ourselves where design is seen as more of making things pretty? And what kind of advice could you give some of these designers?
I'll start with basically stealing everything Dan said, because I'm a huge believer in it. When I think of my design philosophy, it's really about relationship first. So I think you really, like, for everyone, and this doesn't matter how many years of experience, if you're just starting out or if you're like an exec level, it really starts from building those relationships with your partners. And I think once you have those relationships and once you have that alignment on the problem you're solving, then design can really have a place in that strategy level and like helping everyone align on understand the problem we're solving for and align the problem we're solving for, and then ideate together. And then it doesn't become the, okay, I have this thing, here's the PRD, go build it. It's really about we're doing it as one team.
Yeah, I totally agree with all that. Yeah, the one other thing I would add, like, to your question is, just don't call it by name. If you don't say, hey, this is design thinking and we're going to do it, just the process itself speaks, it works. And so if you just do it with your stakeholders and with your team, you don't necessarily even have to say, like, we're going to be a design first organization. Just by the process of like getting there, you get a lot of value.
Yeah, I think design as a term has a lot of different meanings for a lot of different people, depending on who you are and what your background is. I like the idea of involving different stakeholders, doing brainstorming sessions, getting them to sketch, which is kind of intimidating for some, but very rewarding once you gain their trust, once you build those relationships with them, and then you'll get buy-in, and then things will get easier. But it is a marathon, so it's like, do we get our client stakeholders into this design to align session? Yes, that's a small win, right?
Can I actually?
Yeah.
You both had an interesting story about getting your engineers and some other folks who were not artistic. I don't know if that was their words or not, but I thought that was a really interesting strategy around it. I'm going to put you both on the spot to describe it, if you don't mind.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I think, often I find especially engineers, they might have some hesitance in sketching. So it's really going around that. Because again, everyone actually feels really confident whiteboarding, right? Like what engineers or PM do you know that's not comfortable next to a whiteboard? So ideally, like if you have paper, that's also good. Like we like working with this method of like crazy eights, where you fold the paper to 8 pieces and you draw a storyboard. And there's so many ways to do this, and you need to figure out what works for your team. So one thing I like is if you have a room in your office that has a giant whiteboard, just bring everyone there and get them to draw with the markers on the whiteboard. And again, if they don't feel comfortable in drawing, just say write it down in words, or like making sure as you put people in actually like small teams to draw, maybe like the engineers and the operations and the product can say the ideas, but there's always a designer on one of those mini teams, and they can help sketch those ideas. So it really depends on what team you're working on and what is their personality like.
Yeah, it's interesting how you talk about different plays and methods of getting people to actively participate. Are there any other research methods or activities that you guys use on the Uber team that might surprise some people?
I'll let Danielle answer.
You go ahead.
So, I mean, I think one super cool thing about Uber is really making sure we have that empathy with our partners too, which is our driver partners and our couriers. So there's a huge encouragement in the company to actually have everyone in the company drive for Uber and be a courier, including some of our top execs. We have our head of product for the driver team actually is an avid driver, and he makes sure that he has a very high rating. And some of my partners too, like we had our head of engineering for the Seattle team, he would go and do these drives and then send detailed notes and bugs and things like that. So really making sure that we experience both sides, because everyone's a rider, not necessarily everyone understand how it's like to be a driver.
That's awesome. I'm going to ask one more question from Slido, and then maybe we have some time to open up to the floor. How are we on timing? Okay, we're good. We're good on timing. This one's an interesting one for Dan. So Dan, you mentioned hiring as if your job depends on it. I love how the audience is quoting the speakers. You guys are paying attention. How about the other side of things, the firing?
Oh, God. Well, this is going to end this session on a real downer, isn't it? I definitely have had a few situations where it's. I mean, there's a couple things where sometimes you just have a person in the role who's not a good match for what you're trying to accomplish as a team, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they're a bad designer or a bad person. It just means like they cannot wrap their head around that problem space, and so there's been a couple situations that I've been in where we've been able to find a role for that person elsewhere in the company that is a better match for them. So honestly, like that's honestly my initial default, is to go there and see, like, I mean, I want to be an advocate for the folks on my team, and like if I can make that happen for them, I definitely want to. But yeah, there's situations where you're like, you're an underperformer, and I've really tried hard to coach you to a good place, and you just have to, you have to work through that. I mean, I have like we call it employee success, which is ironic, but yeah, we have to get employee success involved and like go through some pretty hard coaching. And the downside of that I found is you wind up, and this has happened to me a few times, you wind up spending 80% of your time on somebody who's your underperformer, and you're shirking your responsibilities to help out the people who are really solid on your team, but you're having to like manage this person to a good place or maybe even out. And so, yeah, it's going to happen to every design leader at some point in their career. And what you should do is just try and learn from it. And honestly, like it has been a learning that like re-emphasizes for me when it happens. Like I need to do a better job of hiring so that I don't pay this penalty.
Yeah, I think you brought up a really good point where it's like maybe they weren't meant for this role, and maybe their skills are suited elsewhere in another department. I think that's about opportunity, right? It's not about like you're failing. It's just because a monkey can climb a tree doesn't mean a fish can, right? So it's like finding that tree for the right person, right?
Exactly.
I actually have one question just to open up for you two, for these two groups, that kind of ties back into cross-functional collaboration. It's a mouthful. I always get it wrong. When you first started out in your career, if you could put yourself in those shoes, because I think a lot of us are either starting from there or are like in the middle of transitioning into a higher role, what were some of the biggest pitfalls or mistakes that you've encountered while trying to embed UX as a foundational strategy?
I mean, I think one of the things that I still struggle with this is making sure that I'm intentional about the relationships that I'm building. And what I mean by that is like, there are relationships with my senior leadership and managing up that, you know, when you make a transition into management, you really have to be much more cognizant about those relationships and building them in an intentional way, rather than my comfort zone, I'm just gonna speak for myself, is being an advocate for the team and doing a pretty good job of managing down. And so you really have to make sure that there's balance there, because if you're not good at managing up and building those relationships, then you're putting your team at a disadvantage for when you have to have hard conversations. And those hard conversations, I'm talking about like leaders on the PM and engineering side, not just the design side, like building those relationships out at the kind of, you know, VP-ish level.
Awesome, thank you for sharing, Dan. So I think it's time to open up for the floor. Does anyone have any additional questions that we didn't get a chance to run through on Slido? We'll pass the mic around. We'll do 3 questions.
Can you hear me? I was just curious, on Uber, you have the kiosk solution, but I kind of felt like it was a cliffhanger. What happens after the kiosk? What's the user experience after they, purchase the car, if you will, at the kiosk?
So as we mentioned, the experience works without connectivity, but you do need to have a working phone, and we make it very clear in the kiosk so you can get the communication and where the driver is and all those details via SMS. Ideally, in a perfect world, you can see the code pickup we talked about in a kiosk together. So maybe one day, in a perfect world, you don't need a phone, but we're not there yet.
Yeah, there was some complexity about the location of that kiosk. So Pearson Airport really only allowed us to place it directly in this corridor between, the threshold of immigration and getting into the arrivals hall. So we had some problems where, if you could not find your driver, you weren't allowed to go back in and access a brand ambassador. But otherwise, it was very successful in other aspects. So, yeah.
Thank you for sharing. We have a question back there. Did everyone get that question? Okay.
I have I'll answer it in a hopefully better satisfactory way, but it's interesting because, so I'm from San Francisco, and a lot of the folks who work at Salesforce work across the bay and take the ferry in, and we have what is known as the ferry mafia. So people will make decisions on the ferry ride to and from San Francisco across the bay to Marin every day. So that's one way to do it, is commute with your executives. Does that happen here? No. But realistically, there's a couple things. One is, acknowledging that time is going to be hard for them, and scheduling it really far out, and making sure that you're doing it get on their calendar on a regular cadence, so that it's not onesie twosies. That helps a lot. I go out for coffee when I can with them, or drinks after work, and talk about some of that stuff, because if they don't have time during the 9 to 5, that's often a good time to get them. So that's the way I kind of sometimes get around it. Scheduling those larger conversations with them, you're right, a situation where you can can block off like a day of like, we're gonna, as a team, spend a day on strategy and we'd like you to attend. Some executives actually respond pretty well to that because they don't feel like they're part of the team. And so positioning it as like, we're letting you into the process can sometimes help too.
So two additional tips. I really like everything you said, but one, make friends with the admins. They're your best people to just make friends with, and they control the calendar, the rooms, everything in the org. So make sure you make friends with them, and they can help you, get the time you need. The second thing I would say is just schedule those share outs. What we did at Uber and back at Google is like, you can add those execs to those brainstorm sessions, but most chances are they won't be able to attend, right? So make sure you carve out the time. So maybe they only attend the voting exercise. So the team brainstorm all day, but you invite them so they get a say to voting. Or if they can't even attend that, make sure you have a share out of everything the team is thinking. And Danielle actually has a great story on sharing the waitizing work with marketing officials.
Story time. No?
Okay, I'll just say, the waitizing work, it was really critical for us to get the buy-in from marketing execs, because it actually is a lot of money that Uber was pouring into to actually make that a reality, right? It's buying, out of home media. So, the team basically, did a share out for those marketing exec, and not only the team got the buy-in to actually do that project, that there was so much excitement that it's rolling out to a lot more places than we initially thought because of that excitement. So I think especially when you're confident that the team is onto something here, and especially if you have some good initial results, on the contrary, try to schedule that time with those people and get your team kind of manage up, get your team the visibility they deserve.
Yeah, I think on that point as well, I think the storytelling aspect has you can really build a compelling case for why they need to meet with you. I've had examples at Uber where I wanted to do something and it wasn't even a project or it wasn't even on our roadmap, but through I guess you need design support to really build like a strong case around it, but if you can make a compelling argument for why this is important for the company, you can't do that with every single deck that you want to present to people, but I think that goes a long way, actually.
Or follow them home.
Yeah, you could stalk them, yeah.
That's really interesting. I'm going to remember that. That's an amazing tactic.
Very mafia works, I tell you.
That's hilarious. Okay, so we have time for one more question. I will let Richard choose the question.
Yeah, I'm curious how you as an individual within your company or your company as a whole make decisions kind of based on first principles.
Could you provide a little bit of context?
Yeah, just kind of like core truths or like fundamental beliefs that your company holds, and how do you kind of factor that in on a more day-to-day basis?
Well, from a brand perspective, we have a brand framework that, every single thing that we do has to, tie back to those sort of, principles, like the guiding principles that we established for our project. It's just a way to sort of ground, the design process and, yeah.
I'll add that I think, hopefully if the company has culture values that can really be addressed and celebrated in the day-to-day, then you can see how the work your team is doing ties back to it. Like some of Uber's culture values are customer obsessed and big innovation, right? So looking at some of how we tie back the work into those, for example, is important.
Yeah, we rely, that V2 Mom framework that I shared, that's something that is prevalent across the entire company. So on an annual basis, that stuff gets reviewed, and those values are pretty consistent across the company. We always are gonna have, trust is one of our number one values, because we really have to make sure that as an enterprise software company, we're protecting our customers' data. But that also means, building trust in the interactions themselves. And so that winds up manifesting itself in allowing us to push for, you know what, we need to make these interactions great and consistent and powerful in order to deliver on that value. And when we're doing our kind of more tactical planning, like that will come up in the conversation just more naturally, because we have that kind of V2 Mom touchstone that kind of everyone knows that language within the company. So that's really helpful for us to have set that at a company level, because then, you know, when you're having those trade-off conversations, you can always look back to that and say, like, well, you know, we force ranked literally everything. Like, where does this fall in that force rank?
Awesome, thank you, Dan. So who has more questions they want to ask? Great. So we're actually going to have a little social, a mixer after this. We're going to wrap up, but we wanted to spend some time so you guys get to engage with the speakers that are here today. It's going to be running until 8 p.m. And we also have a social happening at Shopify just around the corner. If you're interested in that, let a volunteer know and they can give you directions. But I just wanted to wrap up and say thank you so much for coming in today. We've learned so much from your experiences. Let's give them a round of applause.
Thanks to our audience and the awesome questions.
All right, so we're gonna start socializing. I was gonna say drinking. Socialize time.